Her work aligns with the theme for this week. As you know, this week is Sustainability Week, in which our focus is on the oceans. The oceans play a crucial role in the environment. However, anthropogenic factors are negatively impacting the ocean through acidification, bleaching, and pollution. For this reason, Dr. Law's research is critical to the understanding of the way in which we should protect the environment and the oceans. Thank you for the Center for the Sustainable Environment and the Office of Off-Campus Study for sponsoring Dr. Law to be here with us today. If you have any questions about her work, please join us in the Sustainability Center following this talk for a reception that is open to everyone. With that being said, please join us in welcoming Dr. Law.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'd like to thank Claire Redder of the Office of International Programs and Sarah Dawson from the Center for the Sustainable Environment for the invitation to come here and visit Franklin and Marshall College. This is my first visit to the college, and it has been lovely to be here the past 2 days talking with students in the some environmental studies classes, and getting to wander around this beautiful place where it is finally spring. In New England, we haven't quite gotten there yet. So I'll be talking to you today about plastic in the oceans, and I really want to give you kind of a broad overview of our scientific understanding and wrap up a little bit about what we're going to do about this problem. But I want to start where I started. And I started thinking about ocean plastics more than a decade ago. And when I first heard about this problem, the public perception could be summarized by this image: a floating island of trash twice the size of Texas floating out in the North Pacific Ocean. There were things said like an island so thick you could walk on it, you could see it from space, more plastic than plankton. Based upon the decades of open ocean sailing and research and the work of thousands of undergraduate students that preceded me at Sea Education Association and faculty scientists, we knew internally that this simply was not an accurate depiction of the problem. So let's eliminate floating islands visible from space. So if you go to the parts of the ocean where plastics collect, at least at the surface, these are the subtropics. These are the quote-unquote garbage patches. What you'll see from the deck of the ship is typically something like this: flat, calm seas, light winds, you see water, sky. Very rarely you might see a boat pass by. And sometimes an object floats by that simply doesn't belong. So on the left you see a boot, and on the right you see a 5-gallon bucket. And if you are hundreds or thousands of miles from land, this is shocking. You don't expect to see trash floating so far from where the people are living. More frequently, you'll see something that you can't really identify. So on the left, these are probably fishing buoys of some sort. On the right, maybe that's a canister. Even more frequently, you'll just see sort of large fragments of floating plastic. And plastic is pretty easy to identify by eye. This may be various sizes. We don't know where any of it comes from, except in very rare cases. So these are images that were taken on our ship, the Robert C. Siemens, in the eastern North Pacific in October 2012, so about a year and a half after the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, which was a human tragedy and, of course, put a lot of debris into the ocean. So some of the things that we saw from the ship were this floating refrigerator. The crew on board the ship, of course, couldn't bring this aboard and recover it, but they were able to open up the drawer, and on the bottom left there you see food packaging from somebody's home that was sitting in their home moments before the tsunami lifted that refrigerator and put it into the ocean. There were other large identifiable objects. There's a tire in the middle there. And if you look closely, it said made in Japan. On the right, you see fishing buoys, a soccer ball, bottles, some of that food packaging. And on the bottom right is actually a small boat that drifted up right alongside our ship, clearly weighed down by barnacles and other growth that had accumulated as it drifted across the ocean. So in this case, we knew there was clearly a pulse event that put a tremendous amount of material into the ocean, and with reasonable certainty we can say this all originated on that day, March 2011. However, most of the debris that you find in these regions of the ocean, again we're talking open ocean, very far from land, is not readily visible even by eye from the deck of the ship, unless there are very calm conditions and you know what you're looking for. You can't see these things from aircraft or satellites because these are very small particles termed microplastics. So if you take a look, you can see that these are in a variety of shapes and sizes and colors. Most microplastics are derived from larger objects that weaken when exposed to sunlight and broke apart when there were physical forces. Although, even though these are very small particles, not easily seen, they are still a contaminant in the ocean. But it's important to remember when we think about garbage patches, we think about microplastics. Plastics are not only found floating at the sea surface. So if you've spent any time on a beach, certainly you have seen litter, you've encountered trash on the beach. Hopefully it didn't look as bad as this beach in Peru, Marquez Beach, where it looks like this is probably an open dumping site. On the right-hand side, you see a beach in Hong Kong, where by my eye, it looks like probably a lot of this debris washed up from someplace else. Ocean Conservancy has been conducting the International Coastal Cleanup for more than 30 years, where people around the globe go to their local beaches and pick up waste and debris. And what they found is that over 30 years, the largest number of items collected have not changed. So this is the top 10 list, and there are things that you'll recognize on there. Number one is universally cigarette butts. Then there's food wrappers, beverage bottles, bottle caps, cups and plates, cans, bags. These are things that you and I use every day. I'm sure some of you have these things in your possession right now. And one notable fact is that in 2017, every item on the top 10 list reported around the globe was made of plastic. So this is the first year that glass bottles, aluminum cans, and paper bags have gotten bumped off of the top 10 list. Okay, so trash on the beach is a form of marine debris, man-made materials in the marine environment. You may not be surprised to know that marine debris is also on the seafloor. So this is a picture from Newport Harbor in Rhode Island. So an affluent community, big sailing community, recreational boating. And on the seafloor, this is a composite of images taken from a group called the Rosalia Project. There are plastic bottles and cups and beer cans and just trash. In fact, it was done beer can reef. There are other types of debris on the seabed. This is a photo of a diver from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration removing a large derelict fishing net from Midway Atoll. So marine debris is on the seabed. You might be surprised to learn, though, that marine debris is in very deep and very remote places. So this is an image of a plastic bag that was imaged on an oceanographic research cruise at 2,500 meters depth in Fram Strait in the Arctic. So very far from human populations and very intact over there. Well, marine debris can be composed of any material: paper, glass, metal, fibers, cardboard, and plastic. So why are we always talking about plastic? Well, most studies that have been conducted in the open ocean have focused on debris floating on the sea surface because that is the place we can easily access. And what's been found there is almost entirely plastic. Likewise, as I mentioned about beaches, the most abundant materials collected are typically made of plastic, and plastics are also commonly found on the seafloor. But when we think about plastics, actually the most abundant type of debris by count, and the most widespread, are probably the microplastics I mentioned at the beginning. So microplastics can be found in all these different parts of the marine environment, including beaches. This is a photo from Camilo Beach in Hawaii, where the plastics are so thick that you can't really even see the black sand beneath them. They're floating in the water column. We'll hear more about that in a bit. They have been found in deep sea sediments. So these are, those little markers are showing you locations in the North and South Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea where these colorful microplastics were found in the deep sea sediments. And most recently, microplastics have also been found in Arctic sea ice. So in these images, you can actually see a sort of subcategory of microplastics called microfibers, which are, we think, largely derived from textiles, our clothing, our fleece jackets, but also probably from different types of fishing gear. We don't exactly know where these items come from. So in Arctic sea ice, they found an abundance of these microfibers. So as I mentioned, most of these microplastics are formed from larger objects breaking down. But when we look at these particles, we can't tell anything about their origin. That is, we don't know what type of item the particles originated from. We also can't tell geographically where they came from. And to our knowledge, plastics don't ever biodegrade in the environment. So why is plastic debris so widespread? Well, what I'm showing here is a figure of global plastics production in blue, measured in million metric tons, as a function of year starting in 1950, which is the sort of nominal start of commercial production of plastics. And by plastics, we're talking about a wide range of materials. You can think of your commonly used number 1s through 7, you see stamped on the bottom of everyday items, but they're really a wide variety of materials. So starting in 1950, you see this blue curve rapidly accelerating, and in fact, in 2015, globally, the world produced more than 400 million metric tons of plastics. This growth in plastics production has outpaced that of all other bulk materials, so even things like steel and cement and aluminum, and that production has nearly doubled since the year 2000, and there are no signs of slowing. So in fact, if we add up all of the plastics that we think have been produced since 1950, that adds up to 8.3 billion metric tons. I can give that to elephants or Empire State Buildings or football stadiums, and it doesn't matter, they're all really, really big numbers. So we have produced a tremendous amount of this material. When you look at the red curve, this is now a curve of plastic waste generation. And what you see is that curve really nicely tracks the production curve. It's a little bit offset, and that's because of things like computers and cars and durable products that aren't immediately turned into plastic waste. But you see that most of what we use is quickly turned into plastic waste. In this study, we looked at what happens to that plastic waste. So how much of it has been recycled, how much has been incinerated, and how much of it is buried in landfills or still in the environment. And by that work, we think that about 90% of that 8.3 billion metric tons is still in existence on the planet, either in use or sitting in landfills or in the environment. So there's a lot of plastic on the planet, and it's not going away. But if we think about the perspective of the ocean, it wasn't long after the start of commercial production in about 1960 when the first impacts of plastic debris on marine life were documented. So this is a photo that you can't see of a seabird carcass, and inside that seabird there are plastic items that are actually quite identifiable. So this paper was published in 1969. In 1972, the first scientific publication describing floating microplastics was published. That was in the Atlantic Ocean from scientists at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And my organization, Sea Education Association, started collecting plastics in the we started seeing plastics in the late 1970s, and we had a scientist named Jude Wilbur who had the foresight to start counting them, saving them, and recording the data. And in fact, he published the first paper out of Sea Education Association in 1987 in Oceanography magazine describing what we were measuring in the Atlantic Ocean. But it wasn't until 2003 when an article written in Natural History magazine by Captain Charles Moore kind of grabbed the public's attention. That's the first time that I can find that the term garbage patch was used. And so now we started having a public discussion about this vision of floating trash out of the ocean where it doesn't belong. And it was not long after that, only a year later, that Richard Thompson in the UK published the first scientific description of microplastics, publishing data that he had looked at from archives going as far back as the 1960s, describing microplastics in plankton samples. And I would argue that the curve of scientific publications since then has probably followed that curve of global plastics production. We've seen a tremendous amount of increase in public interest in the topic, and as a result of that, also scientific interest. Well, what are the consequences of this contaminant? So why do we care? I mean, trash doesn't belong in the environment, I think we all agree, but what are the impacts on the environment? So what I'm showing here is a figure of the number of individual animals, grouped according to different taxonomic groups, that have been reported to have encounters with marine debris. So this is all types of debris, all materials, and by encounters we're mostly talking about entanglement and ingestion, so eating debris and getting tangled up in it. And what I want you to see first is that the color shading is describing the type of material that the encounter was with. And so all the colors are non-plastics, but the black and white, all the checks and things like that, is all different types of plastic debris. So as of this publication, more than 800 marine species had documented encounters with marine debris, and 92% of those encounters were with plastics. As of now, we know that tens of thousands of individual animals have encountered debris, including more than 50% of marine mammal species, 100% of sea turtle species, and more than 50% of seabird species. Well, what do these impacts look like? I'm sure many of you are familiar with images like this. They're very shocking, and they're a very good way to get public attention. On the left, you see a seabird that's tangled up in a balloon string, and on the right, we see sea turtles, probably in some kind of lost fishing gear. Entanglement is a clear threat. We can very clearly describe injury and oftentimes death to entanglement and marine debris. What we don't know is, in a given population or a given species, what those high-level population impacts are. How are we actually having an impact on population size, especially for species that maybe are already threatened? So this is a very clear negative impact. Plastic debris is a new type of substrate that's been put into the ocean. So lots of things have floated since the beginning of time, natural materials, but plastics are a little bit different because, as I mentioned, they don't biodegrade. They do break into smaller pieces, but they drift around for very long periods of time. And as a result, that provides a new substrate for marine animals. And when we think about large debris, not only do well, the first thing we think about is sort of this floating reef aspect. So this is a fishing net, and you can see fish swimming below it. It provides some protection. So this is a mechanism where animals will actually leave their sort of native habitat to follow underneath this drifting debris. So that's one way that animals can be displaced. On the bottom, you see a ball. We again think from the Japanese tsunami. It's a child's ball. And you can see all kinds of encrusting animals living on it, and a mobile species too. There's a blue crab on the right that's a little bit difficult to see. So we find that if there's an object larger than an inch or two in size, you will often see barnacles or other kinds of encrusting species. But even the smallest microplastics have marine life living on them. This is an example of microplastics on the upper right, and you see there's sort of a green film living on them. That's a microbial community. It's been dubbed the plastosphere, and that's because the organisms, the microbial organisms living on that plastic are quite different in their genetic characteristics from what's living in the surrounding seawater and from what's living on natural substrates such as floating seaweeds. So we don't really know what these organisms are doing on the plastics, if it's just a place to live, if they are concentrating nutrients, if they're some way using the plastic as a food source. We don't really know that yet. But all types of debris, as they're floating around, are transporting these species. And the concern, of course, is that they're transporting species that might become invasive if they go into places that are non-native. So there was a study published a couple of years ago out of Williams College that documented 289 living coastal Japanese species that reached Hawaii and North America for up to 6 years after the Japanese tsunami. So we know for sure that these organisms are being transported to new places. It's too soon to say whether there are any that have become invasive. Okay, another impact, again, I'm sure you've heard of, is plastic debris being ingested, being eaten by marine animals. And this photo up here by Chris Jordan is of an albatross chick from Midway Atoll. It's quite famous. I'd say it's perhaps the poster child for this topic. And inside that bird, which was photographed as he found it, you can see a cigarette lighter and a bottle cap and fragments of plastic. Clearly not something that the bird should be eating. In fact, we now have evidence that over 220 marine species are ingesting plastics, and typically the debris that they ingest is proportional to the size of the animal. So here we've got some zooplankton that were collected off of the UK, where there are those tiny microfibers that were inside of those animals. This is a study of barnacles that were collected off this floating buoy by scientists at SEA, and inside a bunch of those barnacles were a whole bunch of microplastics. And here's a fish that was actually swimming below that 5-gallon bucket that I showed you in the beginning. By some random chance, both the bucket and the fish came up in our net, and when we dissected that fish, there were 42 pieces of microplastic in its stomach. So I think we can all agree that animals shouldn't be eating plastic. If the debris is large enough, it can certainly cause internal injury. It could cause blockages. If you have a belly full of plastic, you're probably not taking in a lot of food that has nutritive value. So there are definite physical impacts of eating plastics. But I think an area where a lot of scientists are concerned is really more around the chemicals associated with the plastic debris. So this is just showing you a sort of glimpse of the types of chemicals that are associated with plastics in the ocean, which include chemicals that were added during manufacture or that were byproducts of the manufacturing process, so chemicals that they came into the ocean with. But plastics are also a really good sponge for some legacy contaminants like PCBs and DDTs that are these persistent chemicals out in the environment. And those chemicals would rather be stuck to the plastic than dissolved in seawater. So these plastics have a variety of chemicals associated with them. And of course, the concern is that if an animal eats the plastics, that those chemicals might transfer into the animal tissue and cause harm. So a lot of scientific inquiry right now is focused on this question of asking, what are the chemical impacts of ingestion of plastic debris? And of course, you can imagine the extension to that is what happens when I eat the fish that ate the plastics. So this is an area of concern, and in fact there is a study that looked at seafood species that were seafood from a fish market in Northern California, looking at both fish and shellfish, and I think in every single species, at least one animal had plastic debris inside its body. It was about 20 to 30% of individual animals in each group, and there were things like plastic films and plastic fibers. So in answer to the question, when I eat seafood, am I eating plastics? The answer is possibly, probably, depending on what you're eating. We don't typically eat the stomachs of fish, so if it's in a fish's gut, you're not eating that, most likely. If you're eating shellfish, you're probably eating some number of plastic particles. But the real question is, does it matter? Let's think about the plastics we're exposed to every day, and in fact, microplastics have now been detected in bottled water, in tap water, in beer, in sea salt, and they're in the air around us. Think about your dryer lint. It's filled with plastic particles. So does it matter? Human health is a big driver for a lot of these questions. Well, here I need to make the distinction between contamination and impact. So we have very clear evidence that marine animals are being contaminated by plastic debris. They're encountering the plastic debris. And in some cases, like this sea lion found off of California, the impact is clear. It had this packing band, which is a sort of common entangling item. They're used to keep cardboard boxes closed, like big boxes. This sea lion got entangled in that. Obviously, there's a clear injury. This was a success story. The blonde bomber was released, rehabilitated and released. But I don't think there's any doubt that there was a negative impact from that kind of contamination. It's a much harder question to answer whether that sushi on your dinner plate is going to have a negative impact, whether that plastic had a negative impact on the animal, or whether eating that sushi is going to have a negative impact on your health. So at this point, this is a huge question. It's a huge motivating question. I still eat seafood, but I think it's something that we really need to take seriously and think about what those potential risks are. Okay, so where does all this plastic debris in the ocean come from? Because if we want to solve the problem, we need to identify the sources. So this is a framework that was developed in a working group at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis that I was involved in. And we tried to come up with, starting with plastic resin pellets. This is sort of the raw material of most plastic products, these little pellets that then get molded and formed into the products we use every day. We looked at those plastic products and asked, what's the pathway to the ocean? So if you think about those resin pellets, they get formed into plastic products, and we're going from the top down here. Eventually, at the bottom level, you're going to see what we were calling the direct sources into the ocean, which are color-coded by whether they're coming from land, whether they're coming from activities on the ocean or maritime sources, or whether they could be coming from both. So our plastic products are either being used, that's the left side, or they've been discarded as waste. So the plastic products in use can be lost to the environment accidentally or unintentionally. So catastrophic events like that Japanese tsunami is a good example of how those products in use might end up in the ocean. There could also be lost fishing gear, aquaculture gear, lost shipping containers filled with Nike shoes or rubber duckies. Ocean science activities specifically put equipment into the ocean that's not intended to be recovered. That's a small number, I can reassure you as an oceanographer. But if we think about the grand scheme of this schematic, what we suspect, our hypothesis is that most of the plastic ending up in the ocean has actually been discarded as waste. So if you follow discarded, you can see that there's waste that is properly managed. That means it's collected, it's contained, so garbage trucks and garbage cans and landfills and incinerators. And then there's waste that is improperly managed. So that's really what we're thinking about here in terms of open dumping. Think back to that beach in Lima, Peru. There is one type of debris that is properly managed but can still end up in the ocean, and that is things like cosmetic microbeads, tiny plastic beads that have been added to rinse off cosmetics as exfoliants and things. If you use that product and rinse your face, those beads go down the drain, they go into the wastewater treatment plant, and some portion of those can escape and end up in the environment. But for now, the goal of our group is to try to put a number on each of these buckets at the bottom and say, what's the largest source to the environment, and then how can we intercept it? So at this point, we really only have a number for the improperly managed waste. And interestingly enough, we did this analysis using zero data from the ocean. So in our group, we had environmental engineers and waste management specialists. And the data set that was most useful for us was put together by the World Bank that estimated how much waste is generated per person per day in countries around the world. It had information about what that waste consisted of, the type of material, so plastics. and some information about how that waste was managed. So whether it was properly managed, captured and contained, or illegally dumped, or some combination. So we took these data and we asked for each country in the world, let's add up how much waste is produced in these countries that have a coastline, how much of it is plastic, and how much of it is not properly captured and contained. And this map shows you the result. So first of all, the goal of this was to say globally how much plastic waste is entering the ocean. And the answer to that from the full global analysis was 8 million metric tons in the year 2010. I'm going to give you an example of how much that is. If you think of your sort of typical single-use plastic grocery bag, imagine that filled with plastic trash. Now picture 5 of them stacked up for every foot of coastline around the world. That's how much 8 million metric tons is. It's a tremendous amount of plastic. What this map is showing you is how much of that improperly managed waste, or how it's distributed globally. So of course your eye is naturally drawn to Southeast Asia, where you see the sort of darkest, reddest, highest values. The reason that Southeast Asia is, we think, the highest contributor at this point in 2010 is because these are parts of the world where they're rapidly developing economies, which means that people have more money and they're purchasing more products and they're creating more waste. But the infrastructure in these countries has not kept up with the waste management. So there simply aren't the mechanisms to capture and contain that waste. And therefore it's available to enter the environment and enter the ocean. So the top 10 countries are generally in Southeast Asia: India and China, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam. But it's really important not to just point a finger and say that's their problem, because the United States and the EU countries collectively are both in the top 20 out of 192 countries in the world. The United States is number 20. And the reason that our numbers are so high is because in the United States, we produce more plastic trash per person per day than any country in the world. So even though we do have robust waste management, we have garbage cans and garbage trucks, even if each of us accidentally loses one candy wrapper, we have a huge coastal population, and that adds up to a really large number. So this is a truly global problem. The mechanisms might be different in different geographies, but it's something we all need to worry about. Okay, so I want to talk about now focusing on the ocean and our work at Sea Education Association. For those who aren't familiar, we run the Sea Semester program for undergraduates. We've been running this as an off-campus study program since 1971. And we have students come to us from all over the country, different colleges and universities, including Franklin and Marshall, who come to us for a semester, and they study for 6 weeks on our campus in Woodsville, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And then they go sailing on one of our tall sailing ships, which are oceanographic research vessels. So a big piece of this program is going out as a full-fledged crew member who's hauling on the sails and navigating and working to cook meals in the galley and working in the engine room, and deploying oceanographic equipment to support student research projects, which is a core of our curriculum. So we've been doing this work to support undergraduate students for decades, and one of the workhorse pieces of gear that we use to collect data is the surface-towed plankton net, or the Newstone net. So what you see over there is, on the top right, is a picture of the net. You can see it's a pretty small, easily manageable piece of gear, and it gets thrown off the side of the ship, where it's towed for half an hour, so about almost 2 kilometers at a ship speed of 2 knots. This is a bird's eye view, so you can see how it's towing along the side of the ship. And that net has a mesh of about 1/3 of a millimeter in size. So we're capturing plankton, anything else floating at the sea surface that's larger than 335 microns. Well, here's where the workforce piece becomes really important. When the net comes back aboard, we dump the contents of the collecting jar into a sieve, and our students spend time picking out anything that is of interest scientifically. So that includes different types of plankton. We measure how much plankton there are. Different students will study different types of plankton, but we also pick out tar, which can be an anthropogenic source as well, and plastics. So the students pick out plastics, and then we report that data in terms of the pieces collected in the net per square kilometer of the ocean that was sampled. So what I'm showing here are the data that we've collected since 1986 in the western North Atlantic Ocean. So we have North America on the left, the Caribbean Sea sort of down below, and each symbol here indicates the location of a single plankton net tow. So we are looking at more than 10,000 net tows over these decades. And then the color of each dot shows you the concentration of plastics measured in pieces per square kilometer. So the warm values are high. The highest values are actually black stars. That's more than 200,000 pieces per square kilometer. I will say that 200 pieces per square kilometer is a very big number, but typically you can hold that amount of plastic in the palm of your hand. Remember, these are very small particles, so it's not a lot of mass, it's a lot of number of pieces. So the first question, my background is in ocean physics, the first question we ask is, where is this collecting and why? So if you look at the pattern, you see that the black stars are all far offshore. This is a little bit counterintuitive because we know that most plastics that are in use on land, and so we presume that's a huge source, as I just told you. But in fact, all of those black stars are far offshore. And in fact, that green star on the upper right is the highest concentration of floating microplastics that we have ever collected, that I know of anybody collected. And that is 26 million pieces per square kilometer. And that toe was located quite literally in the middle of the ocean above the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, so about as far from land as you can get. Okay, so the highest concentrations are far offshore, but if you sort of squint your eyes and look at the warm colors, what you'll see is there's sort of a band between 20 and 40 degrees north latitude where the highest concentrations are collected. And we refer to this as the accumulation zone, but this is really what the garbage patch is, right? And the reason that this exists is because ocean currents sort of come together in this area and slow down in a kind of oceanographic dead end. So this is where these plastics end up after their journey around the basin. Well, what about in the Pacific? In the Pacific, we've been sailing since 2001, so our data set's not as long, but we cover a much broader latitude band. So here we're looking from 20 degrees south latitude, that's Tahiti. Hawaii is sort of the collection around 20 north in the middle there, and then we go as far north as 50. And it's a similar plot. Each circle is one plankton net toe. The color is the concentration. The color bar is a little bit different. What you can see is that the highest concentrations, again, in this figure are between 20 and 40 degrees north. That's also a subtropical gyre, the same ocean physics at play as I described in the Atlantic. But I like showing this because you can see that this plastic is not everywhere. So between 20 degrees north and 20 degrees south, most of those circles are blue. There's either no plastic that was collected or very little plastic that was collected. And again, that's because of ocean physics. So we're going to try to do a little animation here, no sound. I want to show you this at work. So this is a figure of the output of a computer model that takes data that has measured ocean surface currents and uses the statistics about those currents to predict where plastic, if evenly distributed on the surface of the ocean, where that would go if you turn on the ocean currents. So let's see if we can turn on the ocean currents. We didn't actually test this, so let's see if it works. Oh, here. Okay, so you can see at the start of the model run, everything is the same color, plastics evenly distributed, which of course is not the way plastics enter the ocean. But we turn on the ocean currents and you can see very quickly in the tropics, that ocean color becomes white. The plastics are being pulled away at the equator, and that's because there's a divergence. And at the high latitudes. And then in the subtropics, you can see these red patches develop, these garbage patches of this floating microplastic. So this is a nice demonstration that plastics are actually telling us something about ocean physics. We have a hypothesis based on this model, and in fact, if you look at the data that we collected in the North Atlantic and overlay that here. Oh no. This has happened before. Let's see. Those are my kids at the beach. All right, I have it on my computer, but not up here. Ah! Oh. Well, that's a sneak preview of what's coming next if we can get it to work. Don't go anywhere. Okay, all right, thank you. Technical support. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so what were we talking about? This model is a hypothesis about what ocean physics would do. Remember, we sprinkled plastic evenly over the surface of the ocean, but if you look at an overlay of the data we collected in our plankton nets, which are those vertical bars, overlaid on that model result, you can see a really clear correspondence. Now, one thing to think about is, all right, I showed you data from the North Pacific, I showed you data from the Western North Atlantic from FCA. What about these subtropical gyres in the Southern Hemisphere? Well, again, this is a hypothesis. Let's look at the data that have been collected globally using plankton nets to measure floating microplastics. So here is an image of all the data we could find from the 1970s on measuring floating microplastics with plankton nets. And in the North, again, the North Pacific, North Atlantic, you can see largely the SCA data sets represented, although there are other studies in there as well. If you look at the rest of the globe, it's largely white. So we've really not studied the rest of the globe very well. But if you look at the Southern Hemisphere, there are a handful of research cruises that have gone and found, yes, indeed, there are higher concentrations in those subtropical gyres than outside. So still some work to do. But so far looks like physics works, which is good for us. Okay, so one of the goals of that working group I mentioned was to say, all right, we estimated how much plastic we think is entering the ocean from waste generated on land. How does that compare to the amount of plastic we can account for in the ocean from our oceanographic measurements? So because most of that global map is white, I mean, we could just take an average and call it good, but that's not a very sensible thing to do, knowing that there are clear patterns in the data. We turn to numerical models, computer models, to fill in those gaps where we don't have data. So these are 3 numerical models, 3 different researchers, slightly different formulations, but the same physics. And what you can see in the models is that they all have those high concentrations in the subtropics, as we described, low concentrations in the tropics and at high latitudes, but the patterns in the models are all slightly different. So we use the model together with the data to again come up with a global number of the mass of microplastics floating in the oceans. And because of the variation of the models, we have a range between 93,000 and 236,000 metric tons. Okay, another big number. Let's think about that in comparison to our input number. So if you recall that global map, I told you globally we think 8 million metric tons of plastic waste alone, not fishing gear, not from tsunamis, is entering the oceans per year. And this is a picture from of the Los Angeles River following a rainstorm to sort of drive home the point that this is not just an Asia problem, this is a US problem. Well, what I just told you from our data from the ocean is that we're only accounting for about 1 to 5% of that in this form of debris floating in the sea surface. So where is all the plastic? Well, this is sort of a cartoon image to just help you wrap your brain around where this plastic might be. So the boxes that you see in this cartoon, the white box is sort of representative of the marine environment. The smaller boxes inside are what we refer to as reservoirs, so coastlines, including beaches and rocky shores, the sea surface, sea ice, the deeper water column, the sea floor, the sediments, and of course we know some of this plastic is swimming and flying around in different types of biota. So at this point, we really only have a number for the little tiny microplastics floating at the sea surface. We don't know how much debris is in any of these other boxes. So that's a very big question. And it's important to note that there are black arrows between these boxes. So even if we did have numbers for all of them, these plastics are constantly breaking down and they're getting moved in between compartments. So it's still a much more complex situation than represented by this cartoon, just showing you that there are a lot of open questions about this. All right, so we've talked about the science. I hope you understand it's very clear there's a lot of plastic in the ocean. There is great potential for negative impacts. Some is very clear evidence, other we don't know. But we probably all agree that we need to fix this. This is not an acceptable situation. So how are we going to fix this mess? I'm sorry, but there's no silver bullet. So I'm showing you here sort of varied approach of different types of actions that I think we're going to have to take to make a dent in this problem. So first and foremost, you see there's the wedge coming out that says improved waste management infrastructure. I would argue that the most pressing need is to stop that flow of waste from going into the ocean in places that don't have the proper waste management infrastructure. There are other opportunities to deal with waste that's already been produced, things like cleanups, preventing it from entering the ocean to begin with. In terms of fishing gear, maybe incentivizing the return, capturing microfibers in the wash, dealing with recycling systems, which might incentivize people to capture that waste instead of losing it. But I think in terms of really making a difference in this problem, we're going to have to move towards that other side of the circle where we think about how we use these materials, using them smartly, recognizing that they don't go away, so what are the applications that we should use them for? And that's going to mean that we have to innovate and redesign some of our uses that we currently use plastics for, things like packaging. So there has to be a variety of approaches, and don't worry, there are people thinking about this. So in the time that I've been working on this problem, I have to say the topic of ocean plastics has really risen quickly to international policy agendas. So I've had the opportunity to participate in discussions at the G7 and G20 led by Germany, which resulted in a marine litter action plan. Canada in 2018 continued on with that work when they had the presidency of the G7. The UN has a variety of programs dealing with ocean plastics, the UN Environment, there's a Clean Seas program. All of this is around sustainable development goals. And there are even scientists and others in the community that argue we need an international agreement on marine plastic pollution akin to the Paris Climate Agreement. What about in the US? Well, US federal policymakers are paying attention. In 2015, there was a bipartisan bill in Congress that passed easily, and it was to ban microbeads in wash-off cosmetics. So it was a phase-out that now I believe is a complete ban, has taken hold by 2018. So no longer, in the United States, we can no longer have those tiny microbeads in wash-off cosmetics. So that is a policy success. John Kerry launched the first Our Ocean Conference, which is continued annually in different parts of the world. And as mentioned in the introduction, I had the opportunity to testify at a committee of Environment and Public Works of the US Senate to talk about solutions. So the conversation was not about whether or not this was a problem, it was about what are we going to do about it. And then shortly after that hearing, the Save Our Seas Act was passed by Congress, again a bipartisan bill, which has a lot of pieces to it, including reauthorizing the NOAA Marine Debris Program, which is the lead federal agency for this problem. But it's not all good news. As I mentioned, Canada had the presidency of the G7 and drafted an ocean plastics charter, which really aims at more of that innovation and redesign part of that pie. And sadly, the United States and Japan would not sign it. So there's still work to do, but we don't need to wait for the feds. We don't need to wait for the globe. We have things that we can do. So I would argue we need to keep calm and think globally, act globally. And first and foremost, I would encourage all of you to ask a very basic question. Where does my trash go? It's amazing how few of us actually know what happens when you put it in the can or put it out of the curb. And by trash, I'm really talking about different types of waste, but including recyclables and including compost. So I'd highly encourage you to find out where your trash goes, because that may give you a different perception of what you're using and may inspire you to do things that reduce waste. Because really, first and foremost, the less waste we produce, the less we have to deal with. So there's a waste management hierarchy that's been around for decades. Source reduction is right at the top. Reducing our use, so asking yourself, do I need this before you purchase it? Reuse, avoiding single-use products which create waste pretty much instantly. Recycle responsibly, so there's a lot we're hearing about recycling now, and I would say one big message is please don't put things in the bin if you're not sure that they belong there. That's called wish cycling. That actually creates more problems than benefit. And I think that we can also ask manufacturers to take some responsibility for the waste that they're giving us in the forms of their packaging and their products. So that's something we can do. There is a role for what I like this term last chance capture. Let's capture the waste before it goes into the ocean. And that means cleaning up litter anywhere and everywhere. So beach cleanups are a natural thought for folks who live near the coast, because it's very obvious how that trash could end up in the ocean. On the right here is Mr. Trash Wheel, who is an engineering feat from a man named John Keller, who was just a resident of Baltimore and saw all this trash floating in the harbor and said, I'm going to do something about it. So it's a solar-powered water wheel that just traps trash in a sort of boom, and then it goes up the conveyor belt and into a dumpster, and they're keeping track of how much waste is coming into Baltimore Harbor and cleaning up that way. But really, even if you're not on a coast or on a waterway, all of this trash can end up in a river, it can end up getting blown around. So I encourage you to look around your environment, and I have to tell you, F&M is a very clean campus. Bravo to all of you and to your facilities. But even so, really one of the cleanest places I've been, but even so, walking around this morning, I found a cigarette butt. I found a little clip from a pen. Like, it's out there, right? So keep your eye out and pick that stuff up before it ends up moving around and causing an impact in the environment. Even if it's not the ocean, it can still cause impacts in fresh water and soils. So there is a role for capturing. I would also encourage you to think about reduction and recycling initiatives in your school and in your workplace. So telling others and creating new systems and new habits. And then I also encourage you, along the lines of where does my trash go, to engage with your local government and your public works department. So I put no plastic bags. A lot of municipalities are instituting plastic bag bans or fees on plastic bags. There's new rules around straws. There's rules around polystyrene foam. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, so you have to work with your local community to figure out what people want and what people want to accomplish and what they're willing to give up or what habits they're willing to change. So engage with your local community, and I just have a couple examples I want to spend a minute talking about how SEA and our students have been engaging with our local community in Falmouth, Massachusetts. So we have started a program called Trash and Splash. Some of you might have grabbed some stickers or postcards that are in the back. This is a program that was in collaboration with some then 5th grade girls who said, we are really bothered by this problem of plastic in the ocean, and we want to start a Skip the Straw movement. And SEA students work together with them to create this public awareness campaign, which doesn't just teach people about ocean trash, but actually is helping people to think about how to form new habits around choosing reusable over single use. We're also working with restaurants and food service businesses to look at their practices and ask if they can move towards reusable or other alternatives to single-use plastics. So it's really community engagement and asking the hard questions of what are the barriers to changing those habits? How can we help you? We've also been involved in an initiative that was actually started by a man named Alan Robinson in Philadelphia on the Schuylkill River. He's a big rower, and he noticed that in the river the abundance of trash was plastic single-use water bottles. And so he saw that challenge and said, I'm going to stop that. First thing he did was the rowing club said no single-use water bottles allowed. They put in water coolers. And then he had an initiative, a municipal initiative, to put these outdoor water refill stations. So he did that first in Philadelphia. We're fortunate that he moved to Falmouth, and he wanted to do the same thing, and within a year, we have had 2 of these outdoor refillable water stations installed in our community with more on the way. So it just takes passion and some energy and some drive to get these things done, and I encourage you to think about how you can do that too. With that, I'd just like to finish with some acknowledgments of many, many collaborators that don't all fit on this slide. But first and foremost are thousands of C-semester students over the decades, without whom I would not be standing here talking about trash, or I wouldn't have thought about it for 10 years. They really have done the hard work of doing all of those ocean measurements over decades. A number of collaborators at SEA were especially involved in the early work, getting our data out into the scientific community, into the public, including inspiration from a Woodsville oceanographic scientist just down the road, Chris Reddy, who said, the world needs to know what you're doing at SEA. The 2 University of Hawaii collaborators are the ones who created that numerical model that caused us technical difficulty in the middle, but hopefully was illustrated. And then the members of the NC's Marine Debris Working Group, where that group really has asked the high-level questions of how much is going in the ocean, where is it, and what are the impacts, and we're continuing on in that work. And then, of course, we've had support from some federal agencies, including the NSF and NOAA, including the Marine Debris Program, but also support from Ocean Conservancy and other charitable foundations. So with that, I would just like to say thank you.
was wondering if you have like any ideas or solutions to like the cost of reusable items like water bottles, because I do see like people who live paycheck to paycheck or like have limited financial resources, like buying plastic bottles is a lot cheaper than buying like a $20 water bottle.
Thank you for that question. I appreciate that. I've heard the question more in the context of plastic bags, and I think bags are easier because they're cheaper, and I feel like there can be fundraising to sort of distribute bags to folks who might need them. Water bottles, you're absolutely right, are more expensive, although interestingly enough, the cost of bottled water is a lot more per gallon than you would think. So in the case of an upfront cost, I think there are plenty of, there's enough public interest that we should be able to raise funds to buy reusable bottles and things like that for people who need them. But you're right, this is a piece of the question. There are economic costs to changing our habits, to using different types of items, and we have to look at that full picture. It's not just about the whale out in the ocean that most people will never see. Thank you.
Hello, I'm David. I am a Perseo, and this question is pretty multifaceted, but I'm going to try to make it simple. Pretty much when educators like you come in and tell us about things such as plastic or climate change, but specifically on this issue was plastic, many times we see the issue and we understand that there's a problem, but we walk out and we don't change our ways. How is it? I've been through many of these lectures and I've gotten better, but still, I think a lot of us here would definitely need a way of understanding a little better. I do have an interest in the psychology of all this. So how have your results been exactly with what you think?
Thank you for that question. I love this question, especially the fact that I'm at a liberal arts college, because this is not just a science topic, right? And you're absolutely right. People are at the heart of this. People are making the materials. We've made these materials without a plan for what to do with them when we're done with them. And it's not just the consumer's fault, right? I mean, it's not just up to us to stop using straws or decide to carry a reusable water bottle. There has to be a high-level change to solve this problem. I think the benefit of all of you being engaged and interested in even just showing up today is it means that you have at least some interest, or your professor told you to, or you care. I see initiatives around campus. I saw reusable straws for sale. I see recycling bins. I see compost collection at this event. So there's signs of public interest. In terms of an individual, I can't tell you how to give people that spark. I can tell you that when I first started working on our data set, I remember a day that I just sat there and looked at every object around me and was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen all this material, all this plastic, all these candy wrappers and cigarette butts and that kind of thing. And I think that's a big goal, but behavioral science, psychology, social science has to play a big role. And in our Trash and Splash campaign, we've tried to draw on behavioral science research and how to reach people. And the first step is meet people where they are. So if you're in Falmouth, we're fortunate to be living in a community that's very environmentally minded. They had already passed a single-use plastic bag ban. And so we didn't have to sort of spend a lot of time talking about the problem. It's more about concrete solutions. But different communities are going to have a different perspective, and you have to meet them in that place. So I can't say for what's going to make that spark happen for you, or whether it's even going to be plastics. It might be something else. So I think that's where it's sort of community engagement and figuring out what's important to you and what you want to spend your energy on trying to solve.
Thank you.
Hello. My question concerns bacteria and bioplastics. I read that a species of bacteria or fungus that eats plastic was discovered a few years ago. Do you think that collecting, for example, matter from the larger so-called plastic islands in the oceans and using that bacteria to eliminate those plastics, or switching from petroleum-based plastics in, say, products like cups and disposable products to plant-based, so-called plant-based bioplastics, are viable solutions to this issue?
Thank you for that question. We could spend 25 minutes answering lots of facets of that. First, let me say, in terms of the microbial communities living on the plastics in the oceans, we don't know if they can actually metabolize the plastic and biodegrade it. Let's imagine that they can. It's a big biological experiment to try to say, well, let's create an organism and multiply it and put it into an environment that is highly variable in terms of temperature, salinity, oxygen, the communities that exist. So I would say it is not a viable way to attack the problem to say, let's let's create biology in the ocean that can break down the material. There are advances in materials that are not, so most plastics are petroleum-based or natural gas, fossil fuel-based. There are materials that are created from plants, from biological material that is a renewable resource compared to fossil fuels, but some of that is used to make the exact same material. So it is still no more biodegradable than your petroleum-based plastics. There's another class of materials that are biodegradable, but they're degradable only in a commercial composting facility. And so, you know, when I got my coffee at the blue place, I forget the second. It's blue. At the blue place, they sell all. Thank you. All of their single-use products are compostable, but it's really important if you buy something there that you bring it back and put it in their bin, which is going to a commercial composter. So you can't just throw that cup into the ocean or into the environment and expect it to go away. So it's a complicated situation, but thinking about the materials is a great approach, and how can I use them? I would say let's not try to bioengineer our way out of the problem in the natural environment.
I think that bacteria was actually discovered on land
In a landfill? Yeah.
No,
Oh.
or maybe I thought it was actually discovered in the rainforest or something. It was just something that existed already.
Yeah.
That was
Let's
found
talk
that
about that
could
at
consume
the,
plastic.
yeah, let's talk about that more at the reception.
All right, so we're going to continue the conversation. Center for the Sustainable Environment. Let's thank our speaker.